Welcome to the Berlin Time YouTube channel. It's shortly after 4 p.m. here. My name's Andre and you'll be joining me on a little adventure fixing up an interesting watch that I've had for a while. Of course, I'm trying to increase my watchmaking skills and my video skills, so if you do have any comments, critique, or criticism, please let me know. I love being cancelled. So here we go. Now, this watch I found on the Japanese eBay. I've wanted this kind of watch for a while. You'll see in a second why. And it's got this really special feature. Now, when we look on the dial, you can see that there's a bunch of numbers. Now, we have the usual numbers from 1 to 12, basically, in the middle, so 1 o'clock till 12 o'clock. Additionally, this watch also has an extra hand with a red arrow pointing to an outer ring, which is numbered from 1 to 31. But, what could this be? What measure of time do we number from 1 to 31? So basically, this is a pointer date complication. So the hand points towards the date we're at. And this is very typical for Oris, which is the brand. I also noticed that we don't have an engraved crown on this watch. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It just maybe means that this watch didn't come with that crown. Now, for that, we have a nicely engraved case back with some inscriptions. 6651, which is the model number Oris, shock resistant, water resistant, and stainless steel back. And it has a nice straight grain finish on the metal. So let's quickly do a functionality test and see if the pointer date, that pointer date hand jumping is so smooth. That's exactly the reason I wanted to work on one of these watches. It's very nice. Okay, that's working. Now let's check out the hand movement. The minute and the hour hand are also working nicely in the second position. And the pointer date hand jumps at around 3 minutes before 12, which is acceptable. And we can wind the watch in the first position of the crown. And there's a strange sound coming from this watch when you wind it. I think you can hear it on the camera. Basically, when you wind it, it feels like the spring is like unloading its tension and uncoiling itself. So I assume that the mainspring hook is broken or damaged somehow, and that's why the power isn't being stored correctly in the watch. I did notice some aesthetic issues as well. For example, the lume on the dial is a bit darker and has like this grainy texture in comparison to the lume on the hands. So someone probably worked on the hands before. The hands also have this kind of strange shape and reflection to them. So maybe somebody deformed them before. The crystal itself is in a good position. There are some scratches which I'll buff out with some polywatch, but I don't think I'll replace the crystal. I'll just polish it. Now we can put our watch into a protective film and strap it onto the Timegrapher for an initial reading. And doing this initial reading, as well as having these functionality tests we just did together before, helps me to grasp the condition of a watch in a much better way. So you can basically read and analyze what the Timegrapher says to you and what you can feel with and see with your own hands, and assess what this watch might need in a service. So does it need some hairspring regulation, some escapement regulation? And here's a summary of what I found when testing this watch in all 6 positions. Taking into consideration the age and the actual movement this watch is using, this watch is performing much better than I expected. There's only 3 issues I'm looking at here. So basically, number 1 is the beat error. That is pretty high. It should be under 0.4 milliseconds per beat. So we will have to regulate that. Next thing is the amplitude, which probably due to the age and the gunked up lubrication or the missing lubrication is pretty low. Maybe even the mainspring issue we identified at the functionality test at the start. So we'll take a look at that. And the rate is, in my opinion, surprisingly good. The only big issue I see here is that all the positions could be a bit closer together and that there's a big discrepancy between the crown left and crown up position. That is probably due to a hairspring issue, so we'll take a look at that after actually disassembling the watch. So basically, I'll fix the beat error with the stud carrier, I'll fix the amplitude by giving it a service and maybe replacing the mainspring, and I'll fix the rate with some hairspring manipulation. And yeah, that's basically it. Sounds easy. All right, let's go. Now to open the watch, I'm using the trusted old rubber ball to basically unscrew the hardest part of the screw down case back. And once that's done, I'll just use my fingers to gently unscrew the rest and just take it off. And the camera's tweaking, but the movement is definitely not what I expected. This is an older movement. It actually has a pin lever escapement. So basically, we have the standard Swiss lever escapement nowadays, but the pin lever escapement is what came before. The movement is stamped Oris Watches & Co. 7 jewels and unadjusted. And the case back does not have any previous markings, but you can see like the stamping come through, which is kind of funny. I'll start by getting out a dust cover so we can put all the disassembled pieces in there without them being lost or getting any extra dirt, despite them already being dirty. And then I'll go ahead and remove the stem. I forgot to take a close-up video here, I'm sorry, but you basically press down on the setting lever to release the stem and just pull it out. Very easy. It's basically the same system on any watch. And now I'm also taking off the movement holder and flipping over the watch so that the watch movement and the dial can fall out if I lift the case now up slowly. Now the watch has been flipped, and let's just grab the edges of the case and slowly lift up just to make sure that nothing scratches the dial. And there we go. Perfect. We'll just put that on the top right there and align all the hands into one line now. This basically ensures that when you remove the hands with any tool, be it a lever or a presto tool, that you minimize the risk of any hands getting damaged or bent or disformed in any way. Now I'm using this little paper slip with this little cutout in the middle as a little DIY dial protector. It's worked fine for me. I'm just sliding it below the hands, and I'm just going to use these levers I bought to lift the hands up. I did use the presser tools before, but the presser tool basically damaged a dial and a set of hands like a few months ago, and I just basically swore that I'll never use that tool again on a watch that I like. The levers are a bit more pricey, but they're definitely worth it. So the hands have been pried up, and I'll just use some clean water coat to gently lift them off the dial. Obviously, after removing all these hands, I can't forget the sub-seconds hand, which is at 6 o'clock, so I'll just do the same. Use a little dial protector and gently pry up the seconds hand through the dial so we can take both of them off together. I didn't really intend to do this, but it kind of worked out, so I'm good there. Now I need to remove the dial from the movement here, and I'm looking for these dial holder screws, which should be around here, and they basically screw themselves into the dial feet, holding them in place, so we have to unscrew them just a bit to release the dial. Once that is done, I gently pry up the dial from the movement to reveal, ta-da! Okay, it's a bit dirty, but it looks kind of cool, and the camera is tweaking again. I'm very sorry about that. So I'm just going to strap the movement into the movement holder so I have a better grip when working on the watch. And as I said, it does look very interesting. And there's a few things that I've noticed on this watch. For example, the ratchet and the click system are on the dial side of the movement. Usually it's the other way around, which was a nice change of scenery, as well as this wheel, which I thought was missing a lot of teeth. But then I noticed that the tooth geometry was pronounced every 90 degrees. So I assume that this is the jumper, the quick set wheel for the jumper date, and that the spring on the top left here basically holds the position of the jumper date hand in place. So this is probably that system. Now we can start by removing the cover plate for, I don't even know, the dial side, the jumper date system. And this is held in place by 3 big screws. So we'll just take these off. I know, I should have used brass tweezers, but I'm holding the thread of the screw, so maybe that's a bit better. And I'm using brass tweezers here. So let's lift that off. And wow, that looks super complicated. Okay. Okay, maybe this is a thumbnail picture. Now enough joking. It's time to get to work. Now this is the quick set wheel we talked about before for the jumper date, and it's held in place by an extension of the date spring, which basically holds the position of the date wheel in place. We'll just remove the wheel for that there. Okay, lift that off. And let's take off the spring for the jumper date. Another cool design choice is this big component here which stretches along the whole plate. It basically combines a click spring, a click cover, a setting lever, a set lever, and a transmission wheel cover, which is pretty genius in my opinion. So it does all of that in just one component. I just removed the pointed date jumper wheel, and here I just took off the minute wheel with the pointed date transmission wheel. Now with those two parts out of the way, we can start removing the 2 screws holding down the big multifunctional part I talked about before. So the setting spring slash clutch spring slash click spring holder. And these 2 screws will leave, 1 and 2. And we can take that off with a bit of a click. Oh, okay. I did jump away a bit in the end, but nothing too bad. It didn't go to space. And we can just fiddle that out of the movement and put it into our dust cover. Now the tab on the bottom side here is actually what interacts with the click, which is kind of cool in my opinion. Take off the click, take off another part of the quick set system, the transmission wheel, which allows us to set the time basically. Now we have 1 spring left over. Usually that would be for the yoke and the gearless setting, but no, this spring is actually for the quick set date. So this allows the quick set wheel to change its engagement. So basically when you change the position, it regulates the depth of engagement. Now we come to the cannon pinion. Just pry that off there with some tweezers and the set lever. My tweezers do look a bit round. Maybe I have to dress them again. And now we can pull out the stem, nice and easy, and remove the winding clutch. That is pretty nasty where the stem goes in. You can see all the black gunk around the hole there. And with that, the dial style is basically done. We'll flip over the movement to what I would usually say is the exciting side of the watch. But in my opinion, the dial side is the more interesting one because it actually deals with the pointer day complication, and I actually had to think, okay, what does this do? What does that do? But I mean, that's only my opinion. What do you guys think? Now, the movement side is pretty safe. It's pretty simple. You can see the balance moves nicely, so we'll just go ahead and remove that first, because if we do damage it while disassembling the watch, that would be a bummer. So let's just gently take this off here. I'm a bit afraid to... Whoa. Okay, that really did take a bit of strength. And let's see if we can gently just wiggle it out of the watch. You can see that the hairspring, the most sensitive spring in the watch, is actually just hanging down there. And the balance is a bit too heavy, so I'll just grab underneath the balance wheel and above the balance cock to lift both out as one unit. And I'm doing this because the hairspring is a bit elastic and I don't want to damage it by taking out the wrong way. Now with the complete balance removed, I can test the end shake of all the movement components, starting with the pallet fork here. The end shake is basically the freedom of movement a component has up and down and side to side. While it's important for moving components to have some sort of end shake so that the transmitting power doesn't get stuck in the watch, this pin lever had a bit too much end shake in my opinion, but maybe it's necessary because this is a pin lever escapement and I just don't have any experience working on these. I took off the bridge, took off the pin lever, and now we're going to go ahead and check the end shake of the whole gear train, starting with the escapement wheel. I'm just grabbing one of the arms, just gently moving it up and down and looking at how the pivot moves in the bearing and how the haptic feedback feels in my fingers. And that's basically just enough. And you just really need experience for this. It takes a while, but you'll get it out. Of course, we can't forget the barrel. Now this one's a bit more tricky because you have two end shakes you have to check here. One's the barrel in the barrel bridge, and then later on you can check the barrel arbor in the barrel itself. Then we can take off the barrel bridge, and while I'm doing so, you might be asking yourself, why is Andre showing us this? Why is he doing all this testing before? Well, that's just because I'm trying to give you guys the most in-depth look possible of how I work and showing you guys my method of eliminating any potential mistake sources which could impact the watch's performance later after the service. With that being said, we are just in time to take off the barrel bridge, and with that, the gear train bridge as well, which funnily enough was secured by the same screws. We can start disassembling the gear train, starting with the minute wheel. I'm sorry for my super shaky hands. I haven't eaten breakfast or lunch. Now I took off the barrel as well as the ratchet wheel here. And then taking off the seconds wheel, the fourth wheel, and finally the escapement wheel. And with that, the movement side is done. Super easy, just as I said. Interesting to note here is that we only have steel bearings. Now our next victim is the barrel here, which will definitely have to pop open to find out the source of that strange sound we heard at the start of the video when we were winding the watch. And for that, I'll just use this brass plate and some tweezers to pop off the lid. Just press down on the teeth on the side and whoa, that was super healthy. Now from the outside, it looks pretty decent, not too dirty, pretty clean. And we'll just have to take out the arbor and the mainspring to find out what the actual problem was now. Now getting this arbor out was a real pain in the ass, but I managed to do it with some steel tweezers, so I'm shaking it to show my dominance. We're just going to go ahead and actually take out the mainspring. So use your tweezers to get the first two coils of the mainspring and prop them out using the tweezers or your fingers. And once that is done, you can basically use your fingers to get the other coils of the mainspring out and just alternate the finger movements to coax more and more of the mainspring to get out the barrel. Now, do hold the barrel tightly because the mainspring has the tendency to unwind in an instant. So yeah, here's a little time lapse. And we should be nearing the end of the mainspring here. Oh, that was a bit unexpected. You can see that the mainspring hook is still in the barrel while it should be connected to the mainspring. And this would basically allow it to build up tension. And since that is not there, it would just slip through. And that's the sound we heard at the start. So that definitely has to get replaced. So yay to the amplitude, but sad for the mainspring since it has lived its final wind. So let's take these parts away. And I did build the balance and the gear train bridge onto the base plate again because I do have to remove the shock settings. And for this, we'll just take off the intricately shaped shock spring here. I think this is some sort of Neva shock or some older version of that, as well as the cap jewel and the jewel cap of the shock setting. And this basically allows the balance to, first of all, have some sort of bearing to lie in with low friction properties and to be shock protected in the axial and radial direction. Exactly. Now goodbye cap jewel, and then goodbye shock setting. And a cinematic shot of all parts before coming to the actual loading of the cleaning basket of the watch cleaning machine I'm using. I did introduce it before on the channel. If you're interested, go check it out. It is a piece of history in my opinion. Yeah. Now I'm using 3 main baskets here and a small parts basket. The small parts basket is just for the small, sensitive, and finicky parts like the jewel settings or the escapement wheel or the pallet fork. Now the base plate with the balance cock and the hairspring usually gets put in its separate own basket because we don't want the wheels or screws getting tangled in with the hairspring, because that is the most important spring of the watch. And I'm just sorting the other components together into their compartments by logical order. So basically all the wheels, for example, come together, or the whole winding system comes together, or the bridges with the screws come together. That way I make sure that I don't mix up screws, for example, and I can just empirically make a quick connection of what belongs to where and what works with what. Of course, sometimes a part does end up in a different compartment after the cleaning cycle, but usually you just have to have a little quick think and be like, oh, this belongs here. Okay, no problem. Now we'll leave the dowel upstairs and take the cleaning basket into the cellar, because that's where my cleaning setup is now. The ammonia smell of the cleaning fluids was bothering me a bit in the flat, and I just didn't want to live in a flat which was smelling like ammonia and chemicals. So we're just going to do this in the cellar. We're starting with the cleaning cycle of WF Pro to get all the old greases and grime out of the watch. And then we'll just follow up with 2 rinses of Elmo Suprol. I know that the wave breaker situation here is very critical. Don't worry, I'm working on a solution. It will be there in a few videos. Now, once that is done, we can dry the basket and take it upstairs again, back to civilization. And voila, look at all these clean parts. Dang, they're so shiny, it hurts my eyes. Now, let's hope that they stay as clean as this after I assembled and lubricated them, but I'll be sure to do my best. But before doing that, we actually have to do some surface treatment of some components, and for that we'll be using some epilame. I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly in English. And this epilame basically puts a little coating on the components, which increases the surface tension of the surface, and basically it keeps the lubrication where it should be. And of course we'll coat the escapement wheel as well as the pin lever. Now the important part of the pin lever is to actually just coat the pins which interact with the pins and the arms which interact with the escapement wheel, and not the pivots of the pin lever, because they don't get lubricated. And that's why if they would have epilame coating on them, the epilame coating would just gunk up in the bearing and just lead to increased friction. And we also surface treat the cap jewels of the shock setting, because the cap jewels or the jewel settings have to suspend a little drop of oil in the middle for the balance staff. And this epilame increases the sustainability and the longevity of that oil drop. Now, once they've been treated, you don't really see any difference to the parts, but you just have to make sure that they're all nice and dry, and you just basically use them. I'm taking away the pin lever and the escapement wheel and keeping the cap jewels, because we'll have to put on the aforementioned little drop of oil in the middle. And for that, I'm using this little yellow piece of paper as a contrast so I can see better and you guys can see better. And using my oiler with a little teeny bit of 9010 on the tip. And I'm going to try to place it in the center. That was not the center, but I'll just try to drag it over. And there's no real defined size of how big this drop should be right now. Later on, you can check it in relation to the shock spring, but now I think this should be fine. So we'll just put on the jewel setting and see if this works later on. So let's just gently drop the setting onto the cap jewel and try to get it as centered as possible. Okay, that looks pretty decent. And let's flip it around. And the oil basically acts as a little glue and keeps the cap jewel to the jewel setting. And it's a bit difficult to show here, but it looks decent. I'll show you guys later under the microscope, but we'll just continue with the second cap jewel and just repeat the same process. So take some 9010 and just gently place that drop onto the middle of the cap jewel. Here we go. Oh, that's much better in comparison to the first time. You can see that the oil basically, it's like a really defined drop, and that's what the epilame does. If there wouldn't be any epilame on this cap jewel, the oil wouldn't stay as centered and it would spread out more. And we can just place the jewel setting onto the cap jewel, and that looks superb, if I might say so. Let's just flip it over just in case to see if there's any obvious misses, but man, this looks so nice and smooth, to be honest. That will just move on to the barrel. Now, reassembling the barrel is actually pretty easy. The big job, or the big job in quotation marks actually, is to reinsert the mainspring, the new mainspring we bought after the old one was broken. And it was a bit sketchy because I bought this online off a seller, not on eBay or anything. Just sent him a wire, and then poof, 2 months later the mainspring arrived. And I hope this one fits, but I really hate reinserting mainsprings which are coiled up in this thing. And I know that they usually come in this if you buy replacements, but I just really hate working with these. Now, it's important that we also align the hook of the mainspring and the hook in the barrel so that, you know, when you press it in, nothing gets damaged. So keep your eye out for that. And I'll actually just put the mainspring on the barrel just to see if it like roughly fits. And it does look pretty decent. So I think this is the right mainspring size, hopefully. But we'll just find out in a second. To transfer the mainspring into the barrel, I'll just press down onto the hole there and just hopefully it'll just, I mean, there was a sound at the start, but hopefully the mainspring will just snap down. Nope. It looks like it's more of a weird concave shape and the mainspring isn't fully out of the hole there. So I'll just try it again. This time a bit more. No, hopefully. Watch me struggle. Watch me. In the end, I resorted to some love taps on the staking tool. And this is something we call a fush in Germany. Here, a little definition. And I think I'll implement the fush counter as a legitimate scientific statistical method of rating my videos at the end. Of course, trying to keep it as close to 0 as possible. Anyways, we can move away from the fush topic and start with the lubrication of our first watch component in the reassembly, which is the barrel arbor. And I'm lubricating with HP 1300 here for the contact points of the arbor and the barrel. And this is a little hidden spot which people tend to forget a lot, in my opinion, or for what I've seen on YouTube. So I'm just going to give this spot a bit more attention, add a drop of oil more, so that if this watch doesn't get serviced for another 20 years, that hopefully this limits the damage a bit. Hopefully. We can place the arbor now into the partially assembled barrel, make sure that the arbor is also pressed in the right way, and make sure that the hook of the arbor is also basically on the same height as the slot on the mainspring. I'm just going to lubricate the top of the arbor, so basically the other side of where the barrel lid would interact with the arbor. And place the lid on. And then use a little fancy, cheap AliExpress tool to press it down. That should do it. Sounds nice and firm. Now we can check the end shake of the barrel before moving on. And it's a bit big, but I think the pin lever movement just needs a much higher end shake. Now I was reinstalling the shock setting of the balance and I was about to turn the spring into its appropriate position when I had a little mishap. You can see it now. Well, as you saw there, that slip was very tragic, but I did get it fixed up. I managed to get the hairspring all true again in the roundness and in the flatness. You actually see where I gripped the hairspring with the tweezers in the bottom left there. It's a bit lighter and the hairspring was super soft. Now that I got that pre-assembled, I can take off the balance assembly and the bridge again. And I just don't really like the design of this movement because it's a very cheap construction. Like there's no positioning pins. Usually the bridges, they would have, you know, the threads, as well as positioning pins so that the accuracy and the handling for the watchmaker is a bit better. But this one just literally just has the threads, so it doesn't really fall into place and could still move around. So once it's on the base plate, you just hope that it doesn't move around so that, for example, pivots which are in their bearings don't get out. Enough with the pre-assembly. Now we start with the actual assembly, starting with the ratchet wheel, which gets placed down here. And don't worry about the alignment. This will be sitting on the top of the barrel arbor. So we'll just have to take that out and place it on. Now you can see there's a little marking on the side of the barrel there. That's probably because of the staking tool. We did add one to the fush counter already, so I'll just leave it at that. And the barrel arbor, of course, has to get lubricated using HP 1300 again. And I'll just do this before because usually the bearings of the barrel arbor don't have any oil sinks. So I'm just going to put a dab of oil up here. Then we can just transfer this over the main plate and drop it in. And if you're lucky, this should work perfectly. If not, just maybe play around with it and then you'll see if it falls into place, especially since the ratchet wheel and the square shaped profile of the arbor have to fall into place and the arbor has to fall into the bearing. Now that that's aligned, we can take out the rest of the wheels. So basically the whole gear train. So the minute wheel, the escapement wheel, the seconds wheel, and the fourth wheel. And what I'd like to show you is a little trick I do sometimes. I don't even know why I do it, but it's definitely not necessary. I also don't do it all the times, but it's how I oil the pivots. And usually, you know, you'd oil the pivots from the outside, so into the oil sink on the stone. But sometimes I just like doing this, or sometimes this is necessary. I just wanted to show you that you can also oil super thin pivots, like the escapement wheel pivot here, from the inside. So basically oil the pivot from the inside. And you can see there's a little small light reflection change around the pivot. That's basically all the oil which has accumulated there. And in my opinion, oiling the pivots, if you can do it safely, is super nice because you always get the right amount of oil usually. You can see I'm gently lowering it in, and it's crucial that I don't slip or miss the pivot hole, otherwise the oil would just be on the wrong spot. Here I'm oiling the seconds wheel with some 9010. It's important that you don't oil at the top but at the bottom because that's where the wheel would sit in the movement. And I wanted to show here that I'm using a second dust cover to protect the assembled movement, just in case I need to work on something longer. So let's get the Oris movement out of the dust curve again so that we can install the wheel which we just finished oiling. Just make sure everything's correct. And same here, don't miss anything. And gently in it goes. Just give it a little prod there so it falls down. Perfect. That looks good. Now we did do a little miss here. I should have installed the third wheel first because it's sitting lower than the second wheel. But hey, I mean, it's going to be fine. I won't count this towards the first counter because it's still a manageable mistake. We'll just have to slip it underneath. Coming back to the lubrication point before, here with the third wheel, for example, I didn't oil the pivots. I'm going to oil the pivots the traditional way later on once the bridge is down. And yeah, so basically you can go both ways. No way is wrong in my opinion. Sometimes the oiling on the pivot thing comes in handy, especially if you're correcting mistakes or have to do some checks, but both work. Now we're going to oil the minute wheel. This one actually needs the lubrication. The rough spot here is actually pretty interesting. This is where the cannon pinion comes on, and we're going to oil the seating of the wheel in the bridge, and the cannon pinion seating gets lubricated later with a different lubrication. Here we're using HP 1300 for the minute wheel, and we're just going to drop it on the whole gear train. Or that basically should be done. And yeah, looks pretty simple. Was simple. But before slapping the gear train bridge onto the whole gear train, we still have to lubricate the minute wheel with some HP 1300. And I like doing this because usually the oil sinks on the minute wheel are a bit smaller or hidden. So I'm just going to add some HP 1300 to the big fat pivot there. And then I'll just grab the gear train bridge and smack it on there. And as I mentioned before, because the modern positioning pins are missing, this is going to be a bit tricky. I will use the help of a little red plastic, I don't even know, assembly pen, plastic pen, to make sure that I don't have to touch this, or I can just help it position the bridge or some wheels when putting this back on. The crucial thing is to make sure that all the gear train pivots are in their place without them snapping off. And I'll just turn on the minute wheel here to see if the gear train turns freely, and you can see it's kind of stuck, which means that some pivot isn't aligned. I'm adjusting the escapement wheel here. You can see that it kind of dropped into place, and now when I turn the minute wheel, the whole gear train is moving freely, so that was the right call there. Once we're sure that all the pivots are in place, we can go ahead and tighten down the gear train bridge. This is only done by one screw at first. The rest of the screws follow, and I'm going to use the 1.4 screwdriver to get this nice and tight. When I always re-watch my footage, I'm always surprised how tight I do it, so maybe I have to dial back on that. I don't know if you all can see this, but there's this smudge on the right side of the gear train bridge. It's a bit darker than the rest. Reflection is different. Maybe this angle, no, I mean this angle's a bit more, but I definitely have to remove this. I can't continue the reassembly with it there, so I'm just going to use some Rodico to gently lift the oil film off the bridge. I'm not sure what caused it. Maybe it was my finger, maybe it was some residue after the cleaning cycle. But now that it's gone, we can continue with another step of the lubrication, which is lubricating the barrel bridge pivot with HP 1300. So I just got myself a little oil there, and on it goes. Maybe one more dab, that was a bit too little. Oh, you can see the gear train running already a bit there on the right. And let's smack the bridge on. As you can see, I tried to place it on, but it just flew away, and we'll just tighten it down with a screw and a screw here. And let's get the right size screwdriver, the 1.4. This is literally the same one we had before because it's the same screw. As I said, this movement is very economical, and let's tighten this down to make sure that the barrel bridge and the gear train bridge are pretty tight. And a little last quiver of torque, that should do it. And then if we give the barrel a little stub here, you can see that the gear train, ooh, that is turning so smoothly. I mean, for basically a non-jeweled movement, this is pretty good. To decrease friction even more and over time, we're going to use our specially engineered Swiss oils in the gear train bearings. So HP 1300 for the third wheel and some 9010 on the second wheel. Sorry for my shaking hand. I didn't have dinner yet. It's already deep in the afternoon, and some 9010 on the escapement wheel bearing. Now that was basically it. And we're going to flip the movement around to get the last point of lubrication, the third wheel pivot in the main plate with some HP 1300, because we didn't oil that pivot there in the reassembly. With the gear train done, we can start reassembling the system which is responsible for transferring the power of the wearer's hand, so the turning movement of the crown, into the mainspring, so the watch movement. And with that, we will start with the winding clutch. And I'll use some friction grease here, which is Möbius 9501, on the contact surfaces of the winding clutch's faces, on both sides, of course, since this will be having a lot of friction when in contact with the cutout in the main plate. And I'm just going to drop it in right there. There it goes, nice and snug. And then we'll take out the stem, basically the only connection source of the wearer and the mechanical movement of the watch, and insert it into the side. Before doing that, we'll have to lubricate the stem as well. The stem is probably the most lubricated part in the winding system, in the gearless system, because we have to lubricate the top here because this is where it turns into bore. Then we have the square profile where each face has to get lubricated as well because this interacts with the winding clutch. 3 and 4. And then we can't miss this cutout because this is where the yoke sits in and where it moves around. So this is also a very important step. And with that, it's done. And we can just take this out. And as I mentioned before, gently press it in from the side. If it doesn't immediately interact with the winding clutch, you need to turn it a bit and boom, voila, just like that, it should fall into place naturally. Next, we take the set lever, and this also similarly to the winding stem has a few spots where we need to lubricate beforehand. Oh, hey, that set lever just flew off. I think I have to crawl under the table, and I did find the part. Here we go. So we'll lubricate these spots with Mobius 9504 or a friction grease. I did use Molykote before. You can basically use both. I did hear, however, that 9504 is a bit better in service because when you clean it and wash it, it just washes away, while Molykote just stays, like, it leaves like a white shimmer, which is annoying to clean, especially on high grade parts. I lubricated both steps on the set lever pivot because I think that's where the most friction is going to happen. I'm just placing it down into the stem, and this basically makes sure that the winding stem can't fall out when you operate the crown. I'm going to use the same grease here to lubricate the minute wheel, and this is going to be part of the friction between the cannon pinion and the minute wheel, and this allows the wearer to set the watch and turn the hands while the hands and the minute wheel are still connected to the trainer power, otherwise it won't work. I'm lubricating the post to the transmission wheel with some thick oil, so HP 1300, but you can also use grease here. It really depends on the age and the maker of the movement. Another fun place I like lubricating, or greasing in this case, are the tooth flanks, and this is one of the, in my opinion, one of the underrated lubrication spots because I've seen many watches which have run for a long time, so 20 years plus, and usually it's these small mistakes, which, you know, not mistakes, but small things which start creeping up over the decades. All right, so I've seen wheels in the winding system where other teeth have milled basically a groove into the steel, and I really just want to stop that from happening. So this is definitely a good way to avoid that. Next up, we have our first finicky job in the reassembly, which is the installation of the spring. Usually people would think that this is the clutch lever spring because it's on the dial side, but this is not the clutch lever spring. This is the spring which allows the pointer date quickset wheel to jump out of engagement when we pull out the crown. And we'll just put it in with our two tweezers here, make sure that it's nice and tight so it doesn't jump away. Then put on the transmission wheel for the time setting system onto the post we just oiled, and make sure that the teeth lock down there. All right, perfect. Then we take out the setting wheel. Now the setting wheel engages with both the cannon pinion or the minute wheel and the minute wheel and the arrow wheel and translates the ratios to each other. So if the arrow hand moves 1 arrow forward, the minute wheel does a full rotation around the dial. I lubricated the post with HP 1300 because it's a wheel that doesn't turn too much, and when it turns pretty slow. So we'll just put it onto the main plate right in its place next to the cannon pinion there. Make sure not to hit the bearing next to it with the oiled pivot. That will be fatal for the lubrication, but I think that should be fine. So then we can go ahead and assemble and lubricate the click system. Now, when you see me wipe my oiler on my finger cut, I'm usually wiping off old excess oil I had on it. And obviously, I'm making sure not to hit the same spot again, otherwise it will be useless. If you do keep this habit for yourself, make sure to follow that rule to avoid the contamination of lubricants. Now, the click system is there to make sure that the power which is retained in the barrel actually stays there and blocks the ratchet wheel from unwinding. I'm lubricating the post for the click with some grease because there's going to be some more heavy action friction. There's a little white spot in the front there. I don't know what it is, but I tried cleaning it off. It didn't work. So I took the click out of the dust cover, and now I'm placing it on the post and making it engage with the ratchet wheel. And before we can cover up the dial side, we have one more part to install. And sorry for my nasal voice, I have a very moody case of allergies at the moment. Now this part holds the quickset wheel for the pointer date. And the thing is, I definitely know that it has to get lubricated because it does turn and there's friction, but I just don't know how to because the post is staked into the plate and my oiler is too thick to get underneath, and I don't want to oil the whole plate and just mess up the whole lubrication, make it super nasty. So I think I'll just leave it. If you guys have any idea what to do, let me know in the comments. I am, however, going to post this little pivot there, which interacts with the spring we installed, and the second thicker post, which basically this wheel is for, and this is the winding wheel, which transfers the power of the crown to the ratchet wheel, allowing the wearer to wind the watch. Once you've lubricated the undersides, I'm putting on the bridge now here, making sure that both the center hole aligns and the thicker post on the right side aligns, and that the spring aligns with the post which we lubricated. Not that it doesn't work, because that would be a big shame and an even bigger shame to fix later. Here I'm lubricating the side of the click, ideally where the spring step of the setting plate or setting cover is going to rub against when it actually engages the click. And I'm pressing down the setting cover here, and this little setting lever has to, there we go, engage with the post of the set lever. And I'm just making sure that everything's nice and tight and kind of flat. And this flatness is also usually a pretty good indicator if something's in its place or not, because these movements are pretty heavily engineered pieces of small machinery, and it takes ages to develop a movement, I think up to 2 or 3 years. So usually if something doesn't look correct, it's usually not correct. So you have to go back and check it. Now I'm attaching the setting cover plate, the everything plate, to the movement plate again with the 2 screws. That was the first screw. And now moving on to the second screw. I did notice my screwdriver does look a bit weird. I think I have to dress that one again. By the way, if you didn't see my video on screwdriver dressing and you are interested, go ahead and check that video out. Now, after some self-advertisement, I'm lubricating the click and the ratchet wheel, since these are pretty high friction areas and they do get used a lot because, you know, everybody needs to wind the watch. We definitely have to lubricate and grease the teeth and the contact points of the click and the ratchet wheel. So I did that, as well as the contact points and the friction points of the setting system. So the setting lever definitely needs some lubrication on this side. Move it over, lubricate it on this side with some grease, and now spread the lubrication around by just moving the crown and the stem in the different positions so that the setting lever post actually spreads lubrication around and coats everything nicely. Aside from a few other components which we're going to put on the watch before we recase it, the dial side is basically done, so we can flip the movement around to work on the movement side again and actually make this work tick again, the thing which everybody looks forward to. And let's just hope it's going to work. So I'm going to take the pin fork here and gently press this into the bearing. Now it is very finicky because I don't want to bend the pins either. It's not like a ruby stone from the pallet fork, but I think, oh, there you can really see it fall into place. Let's put on the pin fork bridge, make sure that the pivot is also in its place, and screw that down with this bad boy. If you haven't noticed, the holes for the bearings, the jewel bearings, are actually stamped, which is pretty interesting because it just makes it so much more cheaper to do that. Now we can insert the stem and wind the watch. You can see that the gear train isn't moving anymore, which is pretty good, which means that the pin lever is actually stopping the flow of power as it should. So with that all in place, we can actually take out the balance and try to get this watch back running again. I'm very excited to see if it worked and if it works good. And we can gently turn the balance around here, but carefully because the balance wheel was a bit heavy, and just gently lift it up, not to stress the hairspring too much. Let's see if the balance pivot can find its way into the shock protection bearing, and gently lowered it down. Okay, it was super finicky. You can see how soft the hairspring is. Press it down and give it a little. Oh yes, lovely. Look at that beauty go. Perfect. So good news, the watch is ticking and it ticks pretty nicely from what I can see from the outside here without a Timegrapher, but we will have to screw it down and let the watch run in for a bit, not only to spread the oils, but to also make the epilam treatment, which we put on the escapement wheel and the pin pallets, create a little groove between the two, making sure that the lubrication stays where it should be and increasing the longevity of the lubrication. Now, while we let that run in, we can look at the case. As I mentioned at the diagnosis part of this video, so at the very start of the video, 30 minutes ago, this crystal is a bit scratched up, so we will polish it a bit. For that, we have to prep the case first, so we'll use some Kaftan tape, some heat tape around the non-crystal parts, so all the steel parts. This is how it looked like after I put all the tape up, so it literally looks like a patient in a watch hospital. And we do this to make sure that the abrasives of the polishing paste don't scratch up the case. So maybe the case is only nickel or chrome plated, and if I would rub with the abrasive on the plating, it might come off, and that would be fatal. It would just ruin the look of the whole watch. And that's why I'm just using this poly watch on the crystal, a very sound and safe way to polish up your crystal. I think by now it's basically industry standard. So we just put a big dab right in the middle of the watch crystal. I think this should be enough. And next to the poly watch abrasive, you actually need a little cloth to bind the abrasive. So either like a paper towel, or as I use, a handkerchief to clean your glasses. And you'll just take whatever medium you're using, and you basically use it to press down on the crystal and just gently polish it around and around. Try to use a different amount of movement, a different amount of pressure, just to make sure that you get everything on the crystal. Now, after some elbow grease, this looks so much better. It's basically new. in my opinion, maybe a bit slimmer, but it just looks great. So I'm going to take off all the tape here. And after we take off the tape, we can actually go ahead and clean the crystal because there might be some residue from the abrasive or just generally residue from all the ages, all the years of wearing. So let's put them into the ultrasonic bath, the case back and the crystal. I'm not taking out the crystal here because the crystal is a tension ring crystal, meaning that it's press fit into the case. So if I put this into the ultrasonic, there's no risk of any glue, for example, coming off. After the ultrasonic bath, I'm going to rinse it off with some household warm, lukewarm water, just to make sure that all the smeary ultrasonic fluids come off and that we don't have any nasty imprints on the metal case. Then we shake off the excess water and place it down on these paper towels next to the sink, and we can use some hot air to dry off the rest of the case. Now I'm using a heat gun because I've been barred from using the hairdryer for cleaning for drying my watch parts because I have broken one before. Now I've been barred by my girlfriend to use this heat gun, and I'm not going to use this too long because it could melt the crystal, but after a good controlled amount of warm air, the case has dried. Coming back to the actual movement, this has run in for long enough, so I took off the balance, and now we're going to lubricate the escapement under the microscope because this is the cleanest way to lubricate an escapement, in my opinion. But you know what they say, ask 10 watchmakers for their opinion, you'll get 11 answers. So yeah, now I'm going to use Mainspring 9415, which is a little pallet fat basically. It's a mixture, oh, that was the wrong one. That's a mixture between fat and oil. And that's what you use for escapements nowadays. Now, I wasn't sure if I should use 9010 because this is a pin lever escapement, and I've never really oiled a pin lever before. So I did ask on the forums, and they usually said 9415. So I'm just going ahead and using this. I'm going to oil or lubricate the teeth of the pinwheel, so the escapement wheel, and I'm just going to oil the contact points of where the tooth would interact with the pin, and allowing it to move once further. And that's basically where all the lubrication has to be. Now, once I'm satisfied with every tooth lubrication, I'm just checking how much lubrication there is. Now, if you see around the pin, there's a little bubble of oil, like a little film where it mounts up on both sides. And that's basically how much there should be, because I mean, it shouldn't be super dry because the watch has to run for a few years without a service. And that's why a good amount of lubrication is always good on these scales. Now, coming back to the actual reassembly, we can slowly look at reassembling the movement into the case again, because we do have the case and we do have the assembled movement. I did put the balance onto the movement again to let the oiled escapement run in a bit, I think around an hour. And now let's see how it performs in the Timegrapher. This should give a much better and a clearer reading of how the service went. Again, I'm testing all 6 positions, and this is going to be a timeless again. The readings this time was much better, a clearer amplitude, a better beat error, and a more stable rate. Obviously, there is still some regulation I have to do, especially in the centricity of the balance spring and the regulating arm, but I'll just do all of that off camera because it's a pain to film, and I'll show you the final regulation at the end. Once I've identified what I have to regulate and actually regulate the watch, we can come to the final reassembly of the leftover parts. So this is usually on the dial side. I think the whole pointer date system still needs to get assembled. So we'll oil the cannon pinion because the arrow wheel has to come on this using some HP 1300. I'm spreading it around. Then some HP 1300 for the pointer date jumper wheel. Once we have lubricated those things, we can take out the parts we just lubricated for. So the arrow wheel first. Let's take it out and set it onto the cannon pinion. Nice and slowly. There we go. Whoops, that was a bit jumpy for a reason, but I did get it seated in the end. Then we can move on to the pointer date jumper wheel. Man, these parts are really not behaving today. And put this right on the post there. And this wheel is responsible for, as the name says, moving the pointer date along once every 24 hours. It has a little specialized spring system on the top there. I don't know if you can see it, but that's basically what's responsible for the jumping action. Now, this wheel, which we're taking out right now, is the pointer date wheel. This is where the pointer date hand sits on. And the next wheel which we're taking out is the pointer date quickset wheel. So this is the wheel which turns the pointer date hand when you manually change the date. Next up, we have the component which locks the 24-hour pointer date hand in place. And that is this spring here. One of these springs, so the thicker one, is for the pointer date hand, and the other spring is for the friction of the quickset wheel for the pointer date. Now I will lubricate this. I'm using grease here because that's the first thing I thought of. I could have also used oil here technically. I'm not really sure what's better. I guess only time will tell. If you guys have any info on this, please let me know. We can gladly discuss why I am wrong or you're right. Now with that lubricated, we can put that onto the main plate now. When installing, we have to make sure that the spring actually engages with the pointer date wheel in the middle and the pointer date quickset wheel on the right there. So as I said, that's the 2 functions it has to fulfill. So I'll gently prop it in place. It's a bit tricky, so I think I'll just use one tweezer to pull the spring for the quickset wheel into engagement, and then it should basically There we go. The tension there. Now let's quickly cover it all up with this humongous cover plate just to make sure that everything stays in its position. So this is, what alignment is this? Okay, there, that's how it should be. Let's drop it on and make sure that the bores for the screws are aligned with the taps and threads. In goes the first screw. And the second screw. Lastly, let's take the third screw, straighten out a bit and drop it right into its place. And once the 3 screws for the plate are in their position, we can use the screwdriver to tighten down the cover plate. Now it's very important to get this pretty tightly down because this actually guarantees a lot of the functions of this watch, for example, are mainly the pointer date function, but also all the setting functions. Now I was a bit ambitious and a bit nervous to see if this is actually going to work with the cover plate on. Just, you know, I wasn't sure if I did everything correctly. So I did test the functions here without screwing down the third screw. So you can see me testing the stem by turning it backwards, then the click system with the ratchet wheel turning, and the quick set date function of the pointer date. And it does work very smoothly, if I might say so. Then obviously also the time setting system, and you can see me turn the hour wheel and the minute wheel, and you can see me also testing for the pointer date wheel, which also jumps 1 hour or 1 position further. And after checking all the different functions and confirming their performance, I'm tightening down the last third screw to make sure that the cover plate is nice and tightly and secured on the base plate. Now I have been working for quite a while and I've noticed that my finger cuts are starting to rip a bit. So I've replaced the one on the left and you can see the one on the right still has a little rip. But we're almost done now, so I'm just going to try to not get the weird part of that finger to touch the watch in any way, which is not going to happen. We just took out the silicone movement cushion and I placed the assembled Oris movement onto the cushion because we will be putting the dial back onto the movement now. I'm careful not to touch the dial with my fingers, or at least as little as possible. And now I'm going to gently rotate this to the correct way so that the dial feet find their place. I'm going to lower it onto the dial just to make sure and press down. That sounded just like it should be. And to keep the dial in place, we'll just screw in the dial feet screws. And these basically press against the dial feet, locking them in place, making sure that the dial can move. And you usually have 2 screws for each movement. We just did the one. This is the second dial foot screw. These dial feet screws love to get lost in the cleaning cycle if you don't screw them in correctly. I'm gonna wobble around and just move a bit. Perfect, looks nice. So let's place it down again. And now we can get on to the hand setting. Now the hand setting this time is a bit more interesting because you actually have to think about when you place the hands on. You know, you have the usual hour hand, the minute hand, and the seconds hand. But instead of a date window, we have the pointer date hand. So we'll have to translate that usual date window function into the hand function and be like, when do we put this on? So I'll start with the pointer date hand. And for that, I'll prepare the movement by moving it along and making sure that the pointer date wheel has just jumped to the next tooth. Then I'll align my pointer date hand and place it onto the dial. That way I can make sure that the tooth and the hand are aligned to each other, and that if the date will jump, the hand would also jump perfectly centered. I'll take out my hand pressing tools. I use the biggest one to press down the pointer date hand right down the middle. Now I do have to use a lot of pressure, which feels weird, but I did get it down all the way. And now I'm going to check the centricity of the pointer date. And when we switch, you can see that the pointer date aligns with the dates on the outside ring. Now, depending on how well the ring was printed, there might be differences, but nothing's perfect. Next up is the hour hand. So I'll make sure that the date has jumped perfectly. Then I'll align the hour hand with the 12 o'clock to make sure that the date and the time are synchronized to each other. If I wouldn't do that, it might happen that the date might jump at 3 o'clock, and that would be just wrong. So it definitely has to get synchronized to each other so you get that correlation between the time and the date. I did notice that the hour hand has this milky white cloudy like layer on it, and I did try to clean it off with some Rodico, but it just really didn't want to budge, and I think it's just something with the metal. I don't know why. I don't have a leather buff to buff it out either, so I'm just going to keep it that way. Next up, after the hour hand is aligned with 12, I can put on the minute hand so that everything is nice and synchronized to each other. So the hour hand and the minute hand and the hour hand and the pointer date hand, and press that all down together. Now we will have to check the alignment later, but I'll first put the seconds hand in. This goes in the sub-seconds dial right down there. Make sure that the pivot aligns with the hand hole and press it down with the hand presser. There we go. And now let's check the alignment. So the pointer date definitely works. Everything works. There's no weird friction. And let's see if the hours align as well. So the hour and the minute hand definitely align. That's good. And see at what time it jumps. So it jumps at, okay, so 1 past 12, which is good in my opinion. I'll definitely keep it like this. And we can move on to remove the stem so we can case up the watch. And now we have to press down on the set lever down here. I did this off camera because in my opinion, getting the angle right for the shot is pretty difficult. I'm just putting the dust cover on the movement, and I'm getting out the case, which we did clean nicely. It is sparkling, if I might say so. It is a very nicely looking case. We didn't polish anything there, so the original scratches and wear are still there on the actual case. The crystal has been polished by us, but I'm just going to use this little dust blower, get the rest of the dust off. The big moment to almost finish this watch. Align this right there, and so I'm just going to put this on and drop this onto the movement. Make sure not to get too much of the dial so we don't damage it. And let's flip it around so that the movement and the dial can fall into the case, like so. Put it on the cushion, and now we can reinsert the stem. That would be good to hold against the movement because we don't have a movement ring installed yet. So I'm just going to press it down with my finger and press the stem back in so nothing moves around or scratches the dial. And then once that's done, we can use the big movement holder to press it in. Now we can use the stem as an alignment and press in the tab on the left there so that the movement holder is friction fit and the movement is really nice and tight and secure in the case. The old gasket for the case bag is also really hard and brittle, so I'm just going to replace it with a new rubber one. You can see the color difference is pretty stunning. And I'm just going to use some silicone grease to fatten this up, grease this up a bit, and that'll just increase the protection of this gasket and the apparent quote-unquote water tightness of the case bag. But this is not watertight, you can forget it. It's too old. Let's strap that into the case bag. Use my fingers to pry it around. There we go, nice and snug. Give the movement a final blow of air to make sure that it's clean and free of any dust or hairs or fuzzles. And let's drop the case back onto the watch. Before completely shutting it, we're just going to give this a preliminary close because we will have to put this watch on the Timegrapher to see how the watch is performing after the regulation I did off camera. And even though I did regulate the movement, we will have to see how the movement performs inside the case because oftentimes the measurements do change a bit after the watch has been cased up. So let's demagnetize the watch, just to make sure that no magnetism is left in there, and let's see how it's performing. So overall, I'm definitely satisfied with the regulation results. The 3 points we wanted to tackle at the start of the video, so the amplitude, the beat error, and the rate definitely have been dealt with. I mean, the watch still isn't running perfectly, but for the age of the watch and my skills, obviously, because they always have room for improvement, this is perfectly fine. With the rate, you can see that the watch is running fast in most positions, but has a daily average of around 10 seconds. And the amplitude is much higher than before. We have around 280 in the dial positions and 230 in the crank positions, and the beat error was reduced significantly. And if you look at the measurements we did at the very start of the video, so the red numbers, you can see that there's a big improvement in all the things we wanted to change. So amplitude, rate, and beat error, as I said. And what's interesting to notice is that I also got the crown right, crown up problem a bit solved. So there was a difference of around 46 seconds before the service, and now there's only a difference around 14 seconds. So the issue was the centricity of the hairspring in the balance shoe, I think that's what you call it. And the much higher amplitude is what I personally attribute to the new mainspring, so that definitely did the trick there. All in all, the daily average rate for this watch after the service is plus 7.6 seconds, and it has a delta, so the largest difference between positions of around 16 seconds. So I'm very satisfied with that, and I'm going to keep it this way. I'm going to take the watch off the Timegrapher, but stay strapped in because I still have some story time. Maybe you've noticed, but at the start of the video, I didn't have a watch strap for this watch, and during the making of this video, I went out to the city and bought one, this dark green one. And then the seller asked me if I had any spring bars, and I was like, no. And I was like, oh, maybe they're going to give me some spring bars as well. But no, I got charged 20 bucks for 2 spring bars. So I was scammed. Never again, I'm going to support local businesses. I swear to God. But yeah, otherwise, it looks great. I'm very happy. Enjoy the B-roll. And with that, watch bangers, welcome to the end of the video, coming to the cleaning up part of my workspace. I hope you guys enjoyed the process. I definitely did. If you have any questions, comments, criticisms, let me know. Bash me. I'd be happy to discuss with you. And yeah, this video took such a long time to make. Oh my god, I really underestimated how much time it would actually take to make halfway decent content. I hope you guys enjoyed either way. And here are some fun facts, and see you guys in the next video.